With that, I'm going to open with an introduction. Most people here know who Bishop Tim is, but our listeners at home, wherever home is, may not. That assumes you're good for me to start. Okay. Stealing shamelessly from the bio on the site, Bishop Tim Mansfield was ordained a priest in the Apostolic Johannite Church in May 2008 and a bishop in May 2012. He serves as rector of the parish of St. Uriel the Archangel in Sydney, Australia, and bishop of the Diocese of New South Wales. In 2018, he created the Johannite School, an online learning platform for introductory courses about the AJC, Gnosticism, and spiritual practice. Tim is passionate about communicating advanced spiritual and theological topics in understandable ways to a lay audience, and also in understandable ways to me. And immediately, I can be a difficult student. So with that, I'm going to put the spotlight on you and let her rip.
Thanks, Your Eminence. Appreciate it. Give me a second. I'll just get some slides up. That hasn't worked so well. Sorry. First, I've got to do this.
I flipped the slide switch. You should be good.
Oh, yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Cool. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from Darug country, which is we call Western Sydney these days. And I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm speaking from and their elders, both past, present, and emerging. And I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country you're sitting on as well, and the elders of those countries. Let me see, how do I want to start? I want to say before I begin, please ask questions, because that helps me work out kind of what I'm not covering, I guess, well enough, and also helps me kind of guide where I'm taking this. I've taken on a kind of an impossible task in a way, because I'm trying to take a religious movement that's been around for, well, debatably 2,000 or 3,000 years, depending on quite how you count, and is incredibly diverse and strange and odd. And I'm trying to take the thought of two people from the late 20th century who both wrote quite a lot of material and are very subtle and complicated. And I'm trying to do all that in an hour. So yeah, wish me luck. I'm going in. If you need to ask a question, it's probably easiest if you just stick it in the chat box, and I'll grab it when I can come to a natural pause. If you want to try and put your hand up, I think I can see that. So go right ahead and do that. Let me see. So what's in this for me? Thanks for the introduction, Your Eminence. I guess the bits of me that are salient to this talk, I've been trying to, Gnosticism is a very big thing. It doesn't really have clear edges. There's a lot of kind of outbursts of Gnosticism, even just considering the Middle East and Europe over the last 2,000 years, and trying to get your head around all of them and what they mean and what weaves them together and the commonalities. There's a lot of sort of thumbnail sketches of commonalities amongst Gnostic movements, and that's all good, but it's difficult to really feel like you've got your arms around the whole thing. So I've kind of been up to that for the last sort of 13, 14 years, I suppose. Sort of roughly contemporaneous with that, or slightly beforehand, I have been trying to understand a thing called the integral movement, and I've been participating in that movement largely inspired most recently by the work of Ken Wilber. And I was involved in that prior to being involved in the AJC and prior to really a deep interest in Gnosticism. And in fact, the integral stuff kind of led me on the journey that wound up finding the AJC and wound up with me getting ordained and becoming a part of this church. So the two things have kind of, in my life, they've kind of always run along side by side, but in the immortal words of Egon from Ghostbusters, I've tried to not cross the streams too terribly much and too obviously, partly because the people in the one thing often aren't into the other thing. And I'm kind of, due to traumatic childhood wounding, I'm obsessed with keeping everyone happy, which we'll talk a bit more about later. So what I'm trying to do today is to try to bring these two things together in some way and to get the one to inform the other. Now, I had absolutely no idea how to really approach this topic. So to prepare, I did a sequence of 3 live stream ad hoc extemporaneous talks on Facebook over the last couple of months to try to work out, like, if I'm speaking, what is it I want to say? So today's talk is trying to sort of bring together the themes that came up in those lives, and I still don't know how successful this is. So my hope for today is that maybe I inspire some curiosity about the way these two movements overlap and the way they connect. What I'd like to do is annoy you slightly. So I'm hoping that some of the suggestions that I make might rub you the wrong way and make you feel that that I'm criticizing you slightly. I'm not. I love you, and whatever you're doing is wonderful. But hopefully you'll feel slightly called out by at least one thing I say today. Because if I'd managed that, then what I'm really doing is pointing to a way you might be able to deepen your own practice and deepen your own engagement with your spiritual path. And that's kind of my job. So, okay, so with all context and apologies to one side, let's hop in. So the title of the talk, the subtitle is really the point. So towards a more integral version of Gnosticism. So most of the folks on this call, I'm assuming, know what Gnosticism refers to, but we'll dance around that briefly. But the more important word in that sentence probably is what I mean by integral. And that would entail the slide system having focus so I could move it on. So integral in this sense is a term that's been sort of thrown around through the 20th century and into the 21st. And a lot of it means, a lot of it refers to it's really referring to a way to go about human endeavor in a way that honors all the diversity of who I am as an individual, who we are as people, and to not shut anything out, to kind of to include, to integrate really all the different dimensions and aspects of being a human being. Right now, today, the person most associated with that word is this odd-looking chap. So you might look at him and think, that's an odd-looking chap. And then I'm going to call you out on that, because the reason he's an odd-looking chap is because he has a long-term chronic degenerative disease, and that's left him kind of very unwell, very long-term unwell. So yes, just hold your blithe observations about how he looks for a second. That's Ken Wilber. Ken has written something like 15 or 16 books and co-authored a bunch of others since the 70s. He started off in the transpersonal psychology movement, and he's sort of moved out of that in the last sort of 20 years. He's most noted for a very thick, fat book called Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality. Great title, I think you'd agree. It's really good for holding doors open. It's a great fat book. Wilber's work is how I first became aware of integral, and I owe a huge debt to him, because one or two of his books really, I mean, at the time I was a computer nerd obsessed with philosophy, and his work really got me to focus on the fact that my spiritual life didn't really have much life, honestly, and that taking up spiritual practice and taking spiritual practice seriously was an important aspect of living an integral life, really, of living a full and whole life. He also kind of pointed me to the necessity to spend more time paying attention to my unconscious and the parts of myself that I'm ignoring. And so, yeah, huge debt. The thing with Wilber is that he has used that term and he's taken that term from earlier work, and it's come to mean a thing based on his works that I think's a slightly constricted version of what it originally meant. So my inquiry over the last couple of years has kind of led me back into where he got the term from and the other things it might mean. So I'm going to go back to those earlier sources because in some ways they open a few deeper leads on what on earth we might be talking about. There's a version of this talk where I go through Wilber's stuff. Is really, some people find him very hard to read, and I get that. Actually, in the realm of this kind of stuff, he's a really easy to read author. Ironically enough, and his stuff is really quite accessible. He has lots of sort of pithy little concepts and neat little diagrams that kind of sum up things in a really handy way. And it's complex because integrating all of human experience is a complex endeavor, right? You shouldn't expect that to be a fairly trivial matter that you can master in an afternoon. But I've just realized I had another slide here that's kind of fallen out of order. So bear with me for a second. Yeah, that's someone's graphical summary of Wilber's theory. There's a lot of moving parts, fair enough, but it is a neat little diagram. And if you just proceed neatly through that diagram, you'll wind up more or less understanding what Wilber's on about. So it's quite an accessible way to talk about what integral might mean. There's a version of this talk where I just basically go through that diagram, talk about Gnosticism, connect the two together, and we all win, right? And that would be the talk I imagine most people would be expecting me to give, but that's not the talk. That's a different talk to what I'm going to try and do. Wilber got that term integral from an earlier thinker. So this is Jean Gebser. Despite the French sounding name, he's from Poznan. I should know where that is. It's Germany or Switzerland or somewhere like that. Somewhere where people speak German. And his name was Hans. And then he got annoyed with where he lived and he moved to France and he changed his name to Jean. He was born in 1905. He died in 1973. He wrote a bunch of books. He's one of those great big European cultural thinker brains that you run into. It's very characteristically kind of European polymath kind of a guy. He's really got one book that's in translation into English, and it's his masterwork, and it's called The Ever-Present Origin. It's called that in English. In German, it's called Ursprung und Gegenwart. So origin and presence might be a different way to translate that. The work is, again, really good for holding doors open. And I have to confess that I mostly haven't read it. I've read excerpts out of it. I haven't read the whole book because it's hairy and difficult and I don't have time. So instead, what I've done is read this book by Jeremy Johnson, who's around on all the socials and you can find, and is a really lovely and accessible guy. And he wrote that rather lovely little book, which is much, if you can see my camera, it's a much thinner enterprise than trying to read Ever-Present Origin. So with all apologies. So I commend that book to you. Like if the kind of stuff I'm talking about in this talk you find intriguing and interesting, then take a very small amount of money, give it to Jeremy Johnson and get yourself a copy of Seeing Through the World and read it. Because it's a lovely, accessible little book that gives you a glimpse of what Gebser's on about. Now, Gebser's on about a lot of things. He's really trying to provide a comprehensive kind of vista of the emergence of culture. Now, to put that in context, Gebser's writing mid-century in the 20th century. He's a European. He's got access to the archaeological and anthropological data of his day, but he doesn't have access to the archaeological and anthropological data that's emerged since. So he makes some assumptions. He also doesn't have access to a lot of information about Asian and African history, or at least he doesn't draw on it very much. So a lot of what he's talking about is based within that kind of canonical view of the emergence of European culture that, begins in Egypt and then Mesopotamia and Egypt and then sweeps through Greece and Rome and, rises in the Renaissance. So that's not to say that anything that he's saying is incorrect or wrong, but it is scoped by the context in which he's writing it. So it doesn't really include views of history that include other cultures in other places. And so particularly some of the examples that he uses a string of examples that relate to that sort of mythic lineage of European culture. And he doesn't include other examples that might be from the vast sweep of philosophy in India or Tibet or China or Africa. And there's a lot of philosophy gone on in the last couple of thousand years in Africa. So with that acknowledgement, so it doesn't invalidate what he's saying, it does contextualize what he's saying, and it's important to kind of keep that contextual stuff in mind. The big thing that Gebser is famous for, and hence the big thing I'm going to be leaning on today, is his idea of structures of consciousness. So now Wilber takes this idea on, and if you've run into the Wilber version of this, you'll have certain assumptions about what this means. And some of those assumptions aren't correct when you encounter Gebser on his own. I should warn you, if you're waiting for me to pause so you can ask a question, that's not going to happen. I know how many slides I've got to get through. So there won't be a point where I go, how's that for everyone? Probably. There might be. I might reach that point. But if you're listening to this stuff and you're thinking, I'm not sure that's true, I don't understand what that means, that guy needs to slow down and explain this thing to me, please seize the moment and put a question in the chat, or write something down, because I'll try and make some time for questions as I can. Wilber's version of structures of consciousness talks about these things as developmental stages. And it's fair to say that Gebser's thinking had a developmental character, but he wasn't fundamentally talking about stages. He's not talking about phases of history. He's not talking about evolutionary stages of cultures, really. He's talking about these literally, he refers to it as structures of consciousness, and he's talking about structures in human consciousness. So things that kind of emerge within us as individual people, but also collectively within us as cultures that structure our thinking and our ways of seeing the world and being in the world in particular ways. It's fair to say that Gebser saw these as emerging in time, so that the earliest, there's earlier ones and later ones, but neither people nor cultures kind of clunk from one stage to another stage. They're not stage-wise. They're structures that grow through each other. And so the emergence of a prior structure conditions the emergence of the next structure. And all these structures are present in a culture simultaneously. Some of them might be in the foreground, some of them might be in the background, but they're all present. So what Gebser means when he says integral really relies on understanding what Gebser means when he talks about the prior structures. Because integral is the structure that enables you to see, participate in, and bring to life all the prior structures simultaneously in the present moment. He talks about it as the concretion of time. So what was history and future becomes present now, simultaneously. So a brief dance across the structures then. Very briefly, and then I'm going to go into a little exercise to try to kind of land these a little better. The archaic structure is the first one to emerge, and it's emerged in most animals, really. It's pre-conscious. The archaic structure is that aspect of culture and ourselves that doesn't really rely on conscious awareness. It's the hardest to describe because it's the most backgrounded, and it's the kind of the earliest aspect of human existence. What sort of grows through the archaic structure is what Gebser called the magic structure. And whenever anybody in any of this stuff uses the word magic, if you're a magic practitioner, you have to put goggles on to kind of not necessarily take on that they're talking necessarily about you or what you do, but aspects of what you do relate to this structure, as I'll try and talk about as we go on a little further. So the magic structure is characterized by timelessness, agelessness, the magic of hearing, the magic of words. It's about, it's characterized by a sort of minimal differentiation between the human and the natural world. So that's characteristic of earlier what human ways of being, but as I hope you'll start to grasp, it's also characteristic of you right now in this present moment. That structure is in you. It's always been in you, and you've grown up with it. So then what? I'm not going to talk anymore about it until we get to the next bit. It's very intriguing and beguiling. Also, probably wrong, right? Like, so Gebser had a way of kind of, this is Gebser's way of trying to take what he sees as human culture and kind of tease out threads and bits of it in a way that made sense to him in terms of his understanding of European culture. You might look back on this and go, yeah, Jean, that's not quite right. Like, that's not quite the same thing, or really those two are more close than you like. It doesn't super matter, right? He's not a great historian. He's not trying to kind of say something about all human cultures. He's not an anthropologist who's trying to sort data about encounters with indigenous people and try to make sense of it in that way. What he's really struggling to do is articulate integral, right? So none of this needs to be exactly precisely correct, as long as the faint distinctions between things make some kind of sense. Okay, the archaic structure, and then through the archaic structure, the magic structure, and then through the magic structure, the mythic structure, which is characterized by cycles of time, the grasp of cycles of time, and the kind of the retelling of stories around time and the way time plays out. I think images of idols and images begin to play a role at the magic stage. By the mythic stage, those idols and images become part of grand stories, and the stories tell cyclical truths that then are things that structure human existence. What follows the mythic structure, or what grows out through the mythic structure, then is the mental structure. And this is the one we're most familiar with, because it's really what's characterized most of our cultures for a very long time. So the mental structure is the birth of perspective, the creation of those kind of fine-grained distinctions that we use to characterize rationality. We start to break things up and break things down. Like, Gebser is really fond of wordplay, so he likes pointing out that rational includes ratios. There's lots of, mathematics and ratios that characterize the mental structure. The thing with each of those structures is that the mental tends to try to suppress the mythic, and the mythic tends to try to suppress the magic, and the magic to some extent tries to suppress the archaic. So what Gebser was trying to do, and he's speaking in a somewhat prophetic voice mid-century in the 20th century, is to try to herald the emergence of what he called the integral structure, which grows out through the mental structure. He has this nice idea of structures having an efficient phase where they're doing the job they grew to do, and then they have a deficient phase where they're starting to break down and fail. So what Gebser was pointing to mid-20th century is the beginning of the failure of the mental structure, that it's starting to break down and not work. He considers like materialist rationality as the deficient phase of the mental structure, considering the mental structure as reaching back over several hundred years. Debatably, where some people draw it to Plato and Pythagoras as the first flickerings of the growth of the mental structure, which then rises in Europe to its kind of apotheosis in the Enlightenment, and then kind of in the last couple of hundred years starts to get a bit rubbish, honestly. I think if you've been paying attention through the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, you'd probably agree with me that the mental structure is having some struggles right now, I think. It's really well into the deficient phase. And I think most of us are feeling a sense that there's a need for something new to emerge. What Gebser is pointing out mid-20th century is that it's possible to see the beginnings of that new flowering and emergence into this new integral structure. And he points at artists and early movements in the 20th century that indicate that. So the integral structure is characterized by this lovely word he likes to use, diaphaneity. He talks about translucence, but I like diaphaneity. So the sense that time is beginning to become translucent, that you can see through it. So instead of being locked into the present and being obsessed with the present, the integral structure, the mists begin to part, and we begin to see deeply into the past in our culture, deeply into the depths of ourselves, and more broadly out into the world. And that's why he calls it integral, because the walls that lock us into the present moment start to kind of feather apart and become less solid. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense. I'm conscious that I'm in the middle of a very exciting kind of drag show with lots of exciting hand movements, and I'm into that. Okay, so to sort of land this a little bit, I'm going to get through to this next bit, and then I might pause and just see if anybody's got anything they want to ask. But I think if you're holding any queries or questions or confusion about this bit, hopefully the next little bit will help a little. So Gebser loved talking about art and poetry. I'm not going to do poetry, but I am going to do art, because if you've been to one of my talks before, you know I love a good painting. So let's look at this one. So this is, a lot of you will know what this is. This painting's from about 35,000 years ago. It's on the walls of a cave. They're called the Chauvet Caves. They're in France. It was discovered by three friends 30 years ago or something, I think. And you can't go to this cave because it's such a precious find. So most of us who know it from, there's an exhibit at the site and you can go and look at the thing. But if the best place to really experience this, if you're not actually in France, is a Vanna Herzog documentary, which I've currently glazed over on the title of. If someone knows what I'm talking about and you want to put the title in the chat, then go right ahead. Werner Herzog took a film team in for a week to talk to the archaeologists and to look around the cave and to take some film, and it's beautiful. If you put it on a big screen in a dark room, you feel like you're in the caves. So this is from 35,000 years ago. So the animals depicted, there are cave bears. These are lions. So these lions are depicted because there were lions in France at this time. You'll notice they're a lot of more or less the same lion. If I tell you that they're drawn more or less the same way, you'll notice that they're kind of not really distinct. They blend into each other. And if I tell you that for some of these paintings, here's some rhino and buffalo. Also in France at the time, bottom right, there's a rhino. Or two rhinos. Cave of Forgotten Dreams. Thanks, Cherry. That's great. Wow, 3D. Holy cow. Now, if I tell you that there's a series of horses there, according to the carbon evidence, two of those horses were drawn 10,000 years apart. The same with the lions. They're drawn thousands of years apart. So when I say that the magic stage is characterized by timelessness, that gives you some glimpse of what that means. So just for a second, this cave, there's a hole in the ground. You can climb down into the cave. You climb down into the cave just as your father and your grandfather, your mother and your grandmother taught you to go into this cave, and it's a different place. And the sound is different. It's not like the outside world. The air is different. Something in you shifts when you climb down into the cave. It's a different place, and you take a torch with you so you can see because it's dark in there, and the light flickers on the walls, and there's animals. And the first time your mother took you there, you were terrified because you thought the animals were real, that your mum reassured you it's okay. These are dreams of animals, like the dreams you have when you're asleep. You meet the man or you meet the woman who drew one of those animals, and they show you the animal they drew. And you lie down on the rock and you look at the ceiling and you look at the walls, and the light flickers around you and you see all the animals. Sometimes some of the old people tell you about some of the animals and how dangerous they are. Sometimes they tell you about some of the animals and how they help. Sometimes you just lie there and you watch them, and they flicker in and out of your minds. And those pictures, when you've got them, they stay with you when you leave the cave. And they shift. You see those animals appear sometimes for real. That's the magic structure. That's the magic structure as it encloses you culturally. But that magic structure is present in you right now, right? You use that structure in your consciousness all the time. You're using dream and you're using image and you're moving in and out of image and you're hearing stories and you're making sense of the world through glimpses in the darkness and the flickering of light. That structure is not ancient, it's current. It's in you right now. We try to pretend that's not how we work, right? Like we use phrases like magical thinking to kind of say that we're, we don't do that anymore. That's not our thing, But actually we're using magical thinking all the time. It's how you get through the world. It's how you make it through the day. It's how you cross roads. It's how you make sense of signs. It's how you, advertising uses this structure. Otherwise it wouldn't work very well, right? So it's here in us. So you'll notice a few things. They overlap, they're not distinct. You'll notice that the images blend through each other. You'll also notice there's no sense of depth particularly. So it's pre-perspectival, Gebser observed this stuff. It's before the advent of perspective. Okay, so let's fast forward. Let's fast forward to a different place. So we're talking 15, what is this? The 16th century BCE. This is called the Prince of Lilies. It's a fresco from Knossos. It's Minoan culture. There's a story for this guy, right? And there's the flowering of lilies, and probably the story has to do with when the lilies flower and quite who this guy was and which dynasty he was in and why he mattered. And maybe there's old folks that tell you stories about this guy and how his place relates to your place. There's these kinds of pictures all over the shop, and they often tell cyclic stories about time and seasons and when harvests are available and what's going to happen next, based on the endless grinding of the wheel of time. You'll notice this is drawn out of the mythic structure. The objects are distinct; they don't blend through each other. There's a guy, there's lilies, they're different. He's a human, they're plants. It's a distinct thing. So this is part of the flowering of the mythic structure, which begins much earlier than this. We see it in Egypt as well, but I just like the Prince of Lilies. I think he's cool. His big feathered headdress. You'll notice that the objects are distinct, but you'll also notice there's no perspective, right? So there's no sense of depth. The image is flat. Things are all next to each other. Just exactly as they are in Egyptian stuff, and really just exactly as they are, 2,500 years later. This is the Bao Tapestry, thought to be made in England around 1070. Still no perspective, still distinct objects, still telling stories about great rulers and how they're connected to the present day and battles and, the rise and fall of things, the cycle of time. So this mythic structure persists and dominates for a really long period of time. So what's important about the mythic structure? It's those great stories that tell us, well, look, I mean, if you've got anything to do with if you've got anything to do with a fairly new kind of spiritual movement called Christianity, you're really familiar with the mythic structure, right? Because most of what we talk about as Christianity is really enmeshed in the mythic structure. We have this liturgical calendar that goes through the whole year. Things go through, we have a daily cycle of time in the office of the hours. All these stories that we repeat over and over and over again. So these days, because we're living in the mental structure, we have mental accounts of why we use those cyclic structures to take time and draw it down into the present day. But that's not how things were when the mythic structure was the preeminent structure. When the mythic structure was the preeminent structure, time was cyclic. We don't see that now, but time was cyclic. Everything circled around and around forever and ever and ever. The idea of linear time that progresses into a future doesn't really make any sense. This is how it's always been, and things have always cycled round in the way they cycle round, and Epiphany follows Christmas, and Lent follows Epiphany, and Easter follows Lent, and so on and so on and so on, round the liturgical year. Spring follows Spring follows winter, summer follows spring. Autumn, North Americans, it's a ridiculous fall thing you think you have. Autumn follows summer. So cycles. Okay, where do we go from here? Well, where we go from here is the emergence of perspective. Wouldn't it be great if I'd stuck in the notes who this is? Perugino, I think, is the painter's name. This is one of the first, and you can see it's a really analytical use of perspective, but the same, right? So we've got images, they're distinct, they don't blend into each other, but now we've got depth. Now suddenly, consciously, we're able to see depth and perspective and space. So to go back through those, we start off as a kind of a one-dimensional. We're in a place, there's a point, we go to two-dimensional, and now we're in three-dimensional. So that's the emergence of the predominance of the mental structure. So the mental structure flickers into, by Gebser, the mental structure flickers into existence in Pythagoras and Plato, but it's a great mystery, and you have to be initiated into a secret order in order to have any glimpse of it, right? And it stays that way. It flickers and then dies and then flickers and then dies and never really quite takes hold anywhere. And it doesn't just flicker, obviously, it doesn't just flicker into existence in Europe, it also flickers into existence in Tibet and China and India and lots of other places and cultures. And it comes into preeminence for a period possibly, and then perhaps it disappears again because there's a war and other things happen and overturn whatever civilization created enough space for that to occur. What we start to see at this period is the beginnings of the mental structure taking root within a socioeconomic system that enables it to somehow keep going. We could talk a lot about that socioeconomic system and its advantages and disadvantages and the positive and negative effects that it's had on the world. So let's just bracket that out for a second and stick with the structure itself. So that grasp of perspective kind of, stays with us all through art, and that mental structure persists as the predominant mental structure today. This is an Australian painter called Geoffrey Smart, who I love because he draws freeways, Australian, the great Australian landscape. That's the on-ramp to the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So what's characteristic about time from the point of view of the mental structure is not cyclic. Our fundamental understanding of time in the mental structure is not cyclic. We understand time to be linear. We have understood for some time, we live in a world where we assume time is characterized by progress, that things move forward, that we expect the present to be better than the past. Or perhaps we expect the present to be worse than the past, that we're living in the Kali Yuga and civilization and our philosophy is descending into a dark age. That's still a linear view of time. Whether you believe in progress or regress, it's still a linear view of time. So we understand timelessness and resting in the present. We understand circularity and the notion of cycles. Obviously, you pay attention to seasons. Obviously, if you have anything to do with a garden, you understand that time has a cyclic character. But our understanding of the fundamental fabric of time is that it's a progression in a line. Brad's saying time really is circular, and absolutely time has a circular character. And absolutely one of the things that's beginning to press in on us, I think, in the present day is the way that we've excluded some of those deeper, earlier conceptions of time as cyclic or as timeless. We've excluded those deeper conceptions of time that are still living within us, and we've tried to write them out over the last 100 years and focus exclusively on this idea of time as a linear progression from a past into a future. And those deeper, earlier conceptions of time are kind of pressing back in on us in the present moment and demanding of us that we pay greater attention to them. And that's the emergence of the integral structure that Gebser is trying to point to. So I wonder if right, yes. So let me just, I'm not going to look at Wilber. Let's stay with Geoffrey Smart. So what's the integral structure? So the integral structure, so if we're saying that the Chauvet Caves, the Prince of Lilies, the Bao Tapestry, those are pre-perspectival pieces of art. Then we look at the Perugino, we look at Geoffrey Smart, and these are perspectival pieces of art. They take into account perspective and they're thinking about space. Gebser's formulation is that the integral structure is characterized by diaphaneity, as we've been saying, but also by an aperspectival character. So we step out of this obsession with perspective, of looking at things and seeing things from where we're standing and kind of understanding the spatiality of it. We step out of that particular space and time, and we begin to be able to glimpse or see through those earlier structures as they're present in me, and those earlier structures as they're present in culture. And we begin to be able to operate within that aperspectival, I can't say space, that aperspectival, I can't say point of view really, because that's just another perspective, within diaphaneity, so that all these prior moves begin to flow in and out. Now, I think probably if you're at this talk, probably you will have been noticing the emergence of diaphaneity in your life, I think, in culture around you, and you will have noticed the beginnings of this aperspectival possibility in your own way of seeing. It's kind of what's drawn you to being interested in Gnosticism in the first place, and whatever other wacky spiritual impulses that are manifesting in your own life or have been over the last decade or so. You're in the emergence of this integral structure. It's happening around you. So Gebser, in his prophetic mode, isn't saying the integral structure is something we must labor to bring about. He's standing in the middle of the 20th century and he's looking around and going, you know what? I reckon what I see is this thing beginning to emerge. And we're now, he died in 1972 or something. So we're now 50 years past the end of Gebser's life. So really we ought to be seeing some evidence that this integral structure is becoming more prevalent. And I honestly believe that we are. I honestly believe that's what we've been watching. And I honestly believe that a lot of the drama and the trauma and the difficulties in the modern world that we're watching are the mental structure in the mental rational structure in its deeply deficient phase, and the kind of the death throes of the prior way of being as it struggles to hang on to primacy and totality. And you're not really seeing a great kind of revolutionary upsurge of the integral structure, because that's not how it works. The integral structure is simply present, and we're all in it, and we're beginning to see through time. We're beginning to see through the prior structures. We're specifically beginning to see through the mental structure. We're not throwing it away, because that is not an integral move. We're seeing through it, and we're seeing what's earlier. So part of what I'm going to try and do in the second part of this talk is to talk through the ways in which those moves may intermesh with Gnosticism, how some of what many of us are already doing kind of evidences the emergence of this integral structure. And I'm going to go through a little catalog of them, because what I'm guessing is that most of us are doing one or two of these things, but also most of us aren't doing some of these things. And so what I want to do is encourage you to take up some of these things, because I think, the Church of John has always been a thing that comes to the fore during times of great civilizational change. I won't bother listing them, but if you think about that, it's obvious. I think the reason the Church of John is present in this time is also to be present at a great civilizational change. So it's natural, if you're a Johannite, to feel an organic draw into being part of a great civilizational change. I like Gebser's depiction of the emergence of the integral structure as the great civilizational change that we're living through, because it's not bound within a specific civilization. It's about human beingness as a whole, the emergence of a planetary culture. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. People have made some comments. Does anybody have a specific question about any of that stuff I've set up so far? Because I've kind of finished a summary of the structures. So Is there anything anybody wants to clarify or observe?
Sorry.
So I've got mics on. Monsignor Stratford, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I just have a question when you talked about the. I definitely want to see where all this is going, because I'm seeing some analogs within that model, and they're not entirely complementary. But the
go right ahead, like throw some out, so that, because if that's a thing that's.
I just see that the extrapolation from theosophy, and the theosophy, the quick once upon a timeness is Gnosticism clashed with orthodoxy. What survived predominantly was, through the heresiologists, was this cartoon image of how snotty the Gnostics were. We fast forward to theosophy saying, we want to take that snottiness of how, this misrepresentation of Gnosticism, and we want to double down on it, and we want to amplify it, and we have this kind of, things are always progressive, and there's definitely different hierarchies of people.
Right.
And then I see, this having some really toxic side effect. I mean, it absolutely did compel some really interesting weirdos to ask some interesting questions that ended up with, the occult revival and the work that a lot of us are taking now. But in itself, that the shockwave was tremendously toxic, and I still see that hierarchy, and that is really, again, built upon a misunderstanding, misapprehension of the core dynamic, and I see that kind of being brushed off and having a veneer of modernism applied to it. But so that's just a kind of the critique when I'm sitting here going, okay. But when
is he gonna get past this thing that I'm seeing?
Is that when you talked about the Church of John appearing at a time of social change, we have kind of these three flurries. That we have obviously in the establishment of the Church of John in the 1st century. Not a lot of change that I'm seeing there. We certainly see it during the Middle Ages, but neither at the beginning nor the end. And then I guess we do see Fabre Polyprat at the onset, or at least relatively commensurate with modernism. 1804, close enough to Enlightenment, yada yada. But I'm just kind of wondering what your rationale is for that historical.
I'm not necessarily prepared to defend that statement.
Oh, okay, fair. I was just curious. It was like, what, you're pulling on something, and I was just wondering what that was.
Oh, well, I mean, the end of the 1st century is the beginning of the Jewish diaspora. It's the destruction of Hebrew life and the place where it began, and the turning out of Jewish people into the whole of Eurasia. It's a fairly significant civilizational moment for everybody, right? Because that diaspora then spreads Hebrew thinking out into all pockets of Eurasia. There's a lot going on in the Roman Empire at that time. It's not necessarily falling exactly, but it is, that's a major period of transformation for the Roman Empire. What are the big moments of civilizational change, right? Like, where do you draw those lines, and what's the certainly in the history of this tradition, that particular period was a fairly big traumatic moment, I guess.
I would throw out off the top of my head, you have the end of the Peace of Augustus, because you have the end of Augustus, right? Which means, so you've already had the Roman Empire, but now the Roman Empire changes further into hardcore times. The veneer is off. The veneer of the empire is off. You have the destruction of the Second Temple, the Bar Kokhba revolt, all that kind of stuff. Then you got the High Middle Ages, which of course you got troubadours and Grail stuff, and Roman Catholic Church at the height of its power, the monastic orders, the the flower of monasticism, and of course in beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 1800s, British Empire, sail the seas, rule Britannia, all the, I mean, of course, is there ever a time that isn't significant?
That isn't in turmoil, right? And it's the thing with history, right? Yeah. You from the many stories in history, depending on the point you're trying to make, you take one of those stories and you say, well, this is the most significant thing. The hemlines on trousers went up by 5 centimeters at that period. And that really indicated the need for socks. And socks, ladies and gentlemen, is really what creates modern culture, right? I think you all see my point. It's all storytelling. That's fine. I want to pick up the theosophical thing, because Blavatsky's writing in the context of the urgent requirement for colonialism to justify itself spiritually. So there's a great deal of ferment around this idea of lower cultures and higher cultures, and that European culture is the highest culture. And that if you're English, being an Englishman is the greatest thing of all. And that this naturally gives you the right to head out throughout the rest of the world, subjugate other peoples, take some of them captive, treat them as animals, and enslave them, right? So that's the history of this idea of the progress of cultures through stages, right? Absolutely. And you can't walk away from that. I don't think Gebser's building on Blavatsky. I actually don't really think he's building on he's really thorough and careful. If there's stagey sounding stuff coming out of my face, that's my fault, not Gebser's fault. And it's partly my fault because I spend so much time with developmental psychology and adult developmental stages. But even understanding that stuff, this isn't about, there's no sense in Gebser of things being higher or lower. There's aspects of structures that have a capacity to do certain things and may lack the capacity to do other things. Structures grow through each other, so they're not establishing a higher lower hierarchy. They're like bramble bushes grown through each other, that, you know, some bramble bushes grow fruit and some don't, and that's how things are. What comes through in Gebser, and what comes through in some recent developmental stuff in the last 20 years at least, is a sense that as this stuff begins to grow through, what's happening is a dropping and a deepening and a broadening and an embrace, not a prestige and a higher lower dynamic of some kind. I also have to stress some of the examples because I used an example of you know, imagining yourself as a hunter-gatherer person climbing through a hole in the roof of a cave and looking at the paintings at Chauvet, there's an obvious brain thing that we tend to do. It's like, oh, right. So that's like what a Pitjantjatjara person in the APY lands north of Adelaide might be going through as they're wandering along a songline in Australia right now, because they're tribal hunter-gatherer people, right? Sure, they're tribal hunter-gatherer people living within the mental structure of consciousness, because the mental structure is present for them as well. They've gone hunter-gatherer peoples, well, if there's such a thing, Indigenous peoples living on country in the present moment are also within the structures of consciousness that are present in the world at the moment. They're living a certain lifestyle and they've got a way of doing that within their own context, but they're not at some earlier primordial stage of consciousness. They're in the current stage of consciousness, and they've got their own ways of working that out that makes sense to their living style at the moment. So I think what's promising about Gebser, and the reason why I'm using Gebser rather than Wilber, is I think he doesn't get into this whole higher lower colonial Blavatsky mindset. His stuff is really careful about this much more organic, fluid way of seeing. He wants to acknowledge that things do emerge in time, and that some things happen and then later things happen, and that's meaningful. But he wants to not make that, he has absolutely no intention of making that into a higher lower thing.
I really appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
I really appreciate the question, so that I had the opportunity to give the clarification, because I bet you're not the only person holding that question. So, Jonathan, I think you had a question.
Oh, actually, it was similar to some of the things that Monsignor brought up, and you know, any other questions or clarifications can wait to the end. But thank you.
Thanks. That's great. Okay, well, let's press on, because eye to the time. Right, and we're not even into the meat. Okay, what do I mean by Gnosticism? Let's not talk about that. let's just assume we all know what we're talking about. Okay, so look, one of the things with Gnosticism, one of the reasons I was drawn into this movement myself in my own spiritual journey is that I wanted, I grew up a high church Anglican, Episcopalian if you're from the heretical United States, but a high church Anglican. And I had a depiction of religion. I quite liked the religion I grew up in. You know, our parish priest was a flagrantly florid gay man who drank a lot and had a massive social conscience. And we had roaming preachers from the Order of the Good Shepherd who'd come in and talk about how the mandate of Christ is to care for the poor and stuff, which is all the stuff I needed to hear as a teenager. But really, theologically, it made no sense to me at all. So what drew me into Gnosticism is the sense of there being a picture of Christianity that was older and deeper and more complex and less, well, rationalistic, I think, than what I got handed, because the rationalism is deficient rationalism. If you spend any time with systematic theology and Christianity, it's a frustrating thing. You go in a certain direction and your reason, as a deeper depiction of that mental function that's deeper than rationality, your reason compels you to go in a certain direction, and systematic theology generally insists there's a point where you go, no, okay, stop, no longer in that direction, now turn left, and then keep going that way for a while, right? And that happens over and over and over again. Gnosticism, by contrast, and my experience in the AJC has been, well, okay, let's just keep going down the road. Let's see what happens down there. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, okay, right. Oh, they turned into a weird cult and they all committed suicide. Okay, well, let's not do that. Okay, fine. But there's not, let's not rule it out. Let's not rule it out. I'm going to jump ahead to this slide because I like it. I posted that on social media a few weeks ago. The characteristic of orthodoxy is to try to keep everyone within a nice safe box, because if you go outside the box, everyone could die. Like, legit. I mean, that's Christian life in the 2nd century. I'm fond of saying of Irenaeus de Leon, he wrote some bad stuff about Gnostics, but he was literally trying to prevent his local parishioners getting thrown to lions. So let's cut the guy a break. However, belief's not risky. Ideas aren't risky. We do not fear the wilderness. We're happy to roam out into outside spaces. So some of those outside spaces, I think one of the things I love about Gnosticism is it's leaky. One of the things I like to say about Johannites is because we're really clear on where the heart of things are, we're not particularly interested in policing the boundaries. That compelling image of John listening to the heart of the Savior at the Last Supper is the thing that I kind of rotate a lot of my understanding about what being a Johannite is, I think. It's listening to the heart and not being too stressed about where the edge is. So one of the things about Gnosticism that I think is promising from the point of view of the emergence of the integral structure is this leakiness. It's really natural, if you're interested in Gnosticism, to get interested in Christian mysticism. The books of Enoch. A lot of us have kind of roamed off into temple theology and that beguiling glimpse of what the deeper structure kind of, beneath Gnosticism and Christianity and whatever else may be. People read stuff about the Essenes, and then deeper into like the substrate of Canaanite religion that many archaeologists and academics these days are suggesting is the sort of precursor faith that lies beneath Hebrew religion. Sumerian stuff, Egyptian stuff, and then off into adjacent faiths, to Sufis, to Buddhism, Hermeticism, Rosicrucians. A lot of us these days are kind of curious about indigenous spiritual traditions, and there's some of the resonances between what we get in Gnosticism and what we hear from indigenous elders and the ways they see the world and the ways they depict the spiritual dimensions of indigenous life. That's all kind of evocative and interesting. And there's not a sense of that being something you can't do. Okay, so we do not fear the wilderness. This is a practice, right? So I think if you've come from growing up as a Roman Catholic, or if you've come from growing up as an evangelical Christian, you will have some mental machinery that tells you stories of risk and danger. And it's really common that something, as you are guided by your own, as epinoia guides you to what you need to be paying attention to as a part of your own spiritual journey, entheogenic sacraments, thanks Ada, very true, yes, another place people are drawn. As epinoia guides you on the path that your own spiritual journey needs to take, you will get drawn to places that are outside Christian tradition. It's really common for people to go and explore Sumerian hymns, for instance, or to be curious about heathen practice if you come from a Northern European background, or to get involved in Eastern stuff, to maybe into Tibetan traditions where you're venerating or using devotional practice with alien gods. And some part of you, if you've come from a Catholic or an evangelical background, is going to get a little, I get a little kind of, is it okay to be sacrificing something to Odin? Does that make me a bad person? It's there in the back of my head. So this is a thing to lean into, because that tendency to kind of want to stay inside the box of orthodoxy that's a mental rational issue. So, and I want to be specific. So if you're living in a village in Austria in 1200, and everyone around you, as far as you're able to get in a horse and cart, is a Catholic, that's the sea in which you swim. So you don't need to have systematic theology because everybody is in the same theology, right? You can't see the water because you're a fish. So systematic theology in this kind of box of orthodoxy only becomes an issue when you're surrounded by other possibilities and there's a risk that you might jump the fence. That's when you need a fence, right? So there's various times in the last 3,000 years where those fences have become necessary, and they've become very necessary in the last 200 years as, oh my God, Catholics have to talk to Swedenborgians and all kinds of horrifying things. So that's a mental rational structure that's been built to protect this sort of mythic traditionalism and kind of carry it as a kind of eggshell into the present day. So bust the eggshell, No bird grows to adulthood staying inside an egg. Let yourself off the mental hook, read broadly, and try stuff out. Explore various styles of spirituality and stress like getting outside the box. If you do a lot of traditional stuff, then get out of traditional stuff. If you do a lot of, if you exclusively paid attention to settled traditions, then pay attention to nomadic traditions. Get outside of what you're familiar with and bring yourself into encounter with other religious and spiritual traditions that are starkly different from yours, and ones that make you feel a little uncomfortable, that get you to do things that maybe you're not used to doing. There's some more suggestions I'll come to down the track. Okay, second thing, and I'm going to lean on Wilber here. I'm going to lean on Wilber, which means I'm going to lean on Vedanta. Father Jordan, if there could be some theosophical allergy coming up at this moment, just kind of like breathe through it. It's going to be okay. Because Blavatsky nicked all the stuff from Vedanta, so this might be where most people have run into it. But this idea that many spiritual traditions, certainly not all, but many spiritual traditions have the idea of stages in spiritual development or spiritual growth or contemplative practice or something. Buddhism's like terrific with this stuff. Like they have charts and things with stages and levels that you go through as you develop in shamatha practice or vipassana practice. Saint Teresa mentions the interior castle. St. John of the Ladder has the ladder of sanctity. There's Evelyn Underhill has a set of stages. There's lots of stages. There's a great big Ken Wilber table with like 12 different stages of spiritual development lined up next to each other, kind of with the stages kind of roughly correlated. There's a nice little observation from Wilber. He takes these terms from Vedanta, but he makes this kind of nice little observation that I quite like. And he kind of says, so there's all these different models of kind of spiritual development going up these stage ladders, and that's all great. And like some of them have 25 stages and some of them have 4 and some of them have 9. But if you squint, you can kind of see there's those stages kind of fall into kind of these kind of like significant major stages of development and contemplative practice. Growth stages are about engagement with and absorption with the concrete evidence of our senses. So that might be like going out into nature, being awestruck by the sun rising at dawn, and just staying with that feeling of awe as nature's bathing over you. Or it might be a feeling of delight as you sink into a warm bath. Those are gross state experiences. Subtle state experiences are characterized by the kind of the interior content of the mind. And there's endless examples of those, and we're really familiar with them because subtle state experiences are the very fabric, the very fabric of most of esoteric practices. Most of us understand it. We spend a lot of time constructing mental imagery and focusing on mental imagery and manipulating it and dealing with it. Chant, prayer, incantation, sounds, sights, words, textures, constructs in the mind. Causal state stages are about spacious awareness and what awareness is doing. Causal state stages aren't characterized by content. They're characterized by resting in the spaciousness in which the content arises, whether it's gross or subtle content. And then non-dual state stages are about the free play of consciousness through the prior three stages. Some of those descriptions may not match other things you've read. I don't particularly care. The point is there's a bunch of them, right? And an awful lot of what we do, an awful lot of what's present in a great deal of Christian tradition and what's present in most European esotericism is a total obsession on subtle state stages. It's a great deal of what most of us do. So I would argue that to kind of lean further into an integral structure in your spiritual practice means becoming more familiar with some of the other state stages and how they work. Ada, please go ahead. You're on mute. You're muted, Ada. Ada, you're muted. We can't hear you. There.
Unmuted. Can you
Beautiful.
hear me?
Yes.
Oh, excellent, excellent. I'm just so fascinated by your discussion of, oh gosh, now I'm on camera, I've got performance anxiety and I'm, okay. Whew. Oh shoot, I had it all a second ago.
Deep breath.
All right, I can't believe I'm at conclave. God. Anyway, you were talking about the was the emergent the field. It sounds like the kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven, like Jesus was talking about, and like the thing that people had to leave everything for, and like to get it. That's what I remember having a thing about that during your watching your talk.
The early bit, right? Okay, cool. Yeah,
right,
I mean,
right. And so like, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The emergent.
The integral structure, the emergence of the
integral structure. That's
right.
Like the kingdom of God. You know, like that's who's that guy? I read this book, The Kingdom of Heaven. He's an Episcopal priest, I want to say, and it was Richard
Rohr.
The whole, I don't know. It was
Richard
life-changing
Rohr
for me. Huh?
Yeah, cool. Richard Rohr.
Yeah. That was life-changing for me. It's all about like eschewing the laws of man and the earth, and like you always seek the kingdom of heaven first.
And like the kingdom of heaven, we're talking about something which is here right now and emerging through life exactly as it is.
It's here right now, and you have access to it. And
there's no going somewhere else that's needed.
Yeah,
cool.
And it's not tomorrow. It's not someday. It's right now, right here, right now. It's here. It's imminent.
It's partly about paying attention in a different way.
And then the Jungian talk earlier, because the difference, like the things that were the immanent but transcendent, you know, like
Exactly.
oh, holy moly. Woo.
Thanks.
Yeah.
That's great. All right, I'm going to
Okay.
press on. I'm going to press on. Let's get to.
Sorry.
Okay, no, that's good. It's
Keep
good.
going.
It's a good
Yeah.
contribution.
Thank you.
Okay, so if that's what I'm saying is subtle state stages, then what does one do about it? So if I'm saying ease out of a soul focus on subtle states, what am I talking about doing? So here's some suggestions. Like, do what you want. I'm not the boss of you, but you might consider, like, a lot of us don't pay a lot of attention to the gross physical body. And it might be, some of us do. And if you do, well done you. But it might be a really nice idea to pay more attention to your body. So you might consider doing some yoga. You might consider walking in nature and paying attention to your body as you walk in nature. You might consider dance or other stuff that might potentially
Oh my God.
open up new possibilities of kind of how you work. Okay, if that's all, if you've got all that nailed down, that's all good. Sorry, just a second. There we go. If you are noticing that when I talk about resting in spacious awareness and the paying, like allowing your attention or your awareness to rest on the space in which phenomena arise, but not so much on the phenomena themselves. If that's not super familiar, then a few suggestions of places you might go looking is to practice centering prayer, particularly to look at centering prayer as it's taught by, I think, probably Cynthia Bourgeot and some of her more recent stuff. There's a ways of practicing centering prayer where what you really, you wind up essentially sort of focusing on something. The native practice of centering prayer is to let go of the tendency to focus. So that can take quite a time before it matures into resting in spacious awareness, but ultimately it does. That can take a little while. Something that's more direct that might be helpful. Sorry. Dry throat. Park points out shikantaza in Zen. Absolutely. And centering prayer practiced in the blank instructions and shikantaza are pretty close together. Having done some interfaith dialogue with Zen practitioners, there's some Dzogchen meditation that's pretty similar to both shikantaza and centering prayer as well. So it's these styles of meditation that aren't about, if you're familiar with mindfulness practice, you're familiar with taking your attention and placing your attention on a specific object, and the object is often the breath. The reason there's a lot of reasons to use the breath. One of those is the ways in which that can become a great deal more subtle and then very subtle and then eventually move to objectless awareness. But very often in standard mindfulness meditation, that never happens. You keep your attention simply on the breath and you chain it to the breath. You stalk your breath like a tiger, as some meditations teachers encourage you not to do, and yet many of us wind up doing just that. So an objectless meditation is about taking your attention, removing it from a focus of attention, and then not doing anything else with it, and then allowing the attention to settle like mud in a glass of water, is a classic thing. And that certainly works. It can take quite a long time to get to the experience that we're talking about. So Locke Kelly's a really interesting teacher, I think. He's trained in Tibetan Mahamudra. And one of the great things in Mahamudra traditions is this tradition of pointing out instructions. So it's when the teacher kind of says, okay, have a go at this, now have a go at this, now look there. Okay, hold that. And so they're kind of pointing you to the state of mind that characterizes what the fruit of meditation is. So it doesn't enlighten you in some way. It doesn't kind of take you to some next stage all on its own, but it's a way of kind of giving you a glimpse of the destination you're trying to head to, so that if you're practicing a different form of meditation, it's clearer where you're heading. Locke Kelly's work is really nice. He's got a book, there's some audio courses. It's really straightforward stuff. if we had more time, I'd do one or two with you because they're quite easy. Jeffrey Martin's been doing research on something he calls persistent non-symbolic experience for the last 10 years. He's got a lovely book called The Finders, and he talks about the ways that kind of lands in people's lives. I think that book's really worthwhile. I'll bundle these all up into links, and we'll make the links available in the video when it's published, so you can have this stuff later. And I'll make these slides available as well. From the non-dual perspective, it's worth, I think Adyashanti's quite a good and easy teacher. He doesn't do a lot of stuff that's particularly religious. He talks in a fairly commonplace way that's accessible to most people. He even has a Jesus book, which is pretty easy to get to. There's a ton of Neo-Advaita teachers that you could pay attention to, and increasingly Tibetan Dzogchen's getting something that's more accessible and more available to people. And there's some pathways into that. And if any of that's interesting, then yell at me and I'll try to provide you with some resources. Okay, so we've talked about getting out into the wilderness beyond your birth traditions and kind of easing out of that. We've talked about kind of acknowledging these kind of ranges of different spiritual or contemplative states that you could be exploring, and to kind of ease out of the ones that are familiar experience and trying to get out to some further pieces. My timer's wrong. Your Eminence, should I be stopping pretty soon? Because we probably need some time for questions.
But say we are technically we're into the buffer time, so we've got 12 minutes before the next one starts. I'd like to give people a minute or two to assemble in the next one. So
gotcha. Okay. Yes, right. Okay, so the most important thing is pay attention to your shadow and do something about it. And I don't have any time to talk about that, but like, here's some things you could do. Go buy that book, Choose Again by Deirdre Welsack. He's a Canadian addiction specialist, and he provides you with a handy 6-step process for what to do about your compulsive obsessions that stop you from doing good things. Let me leave you with this closing thought. Immanentize the eschaton. Thanks, everybody. Any final questions? We've probably got time for one question. From somebody who hasn't asked a question or spoken yet, maybe. No questions. Fantastic. The integral structure is emerging in human consciousness globally as we speak. Gnosticism, and particularly Johannite Gnosticism, as we practice it, is already part of the bringing about of that new integral structure. I encourage you to embrace some of the things I've been saying today, and to pay attention to the possibility of diaphaneity and the ways in which the deeper structures in yourself and in human culture are becoming evident to you, and to engage with those in a productive way, and hasten and bring about the emergence of the integral structure as it intertwines with your understanding of Gnosticism. Thanks very much. My TED Talk's on next month. Please come along. Follow me for more tips on spiritual enlightenment. Thank you. End of show.
thank you kindly. I quite enjoyed that. I wasn't sure at the outset when you had proposed the talk exactly where you'd go for it, because
Me neither.
we've had, I mean, it's long kind of floated in and out of the front view between talk gnosis and conclave and whatnot, but that was a very welcome addition, the most useful addition for me, that out of kind of that series of talks and ongoing discussions. And as you can see, I've teleported because I have to look after the dog. And happy birthday, Tim.
Thanks very much.